Well, with me is Anthony Hobley, who runs the Carbon Tracker Initiative, an independent financial think tank which analyses the impact of climate change on capital markets and investments in fossil fuels. And also from New York is Anthony Yuan, a global energy strategist for Citigroup, who specialises on how the global economy can finance a greener world. Thank you both for joining us. Anthony, in the studio, I'll start with you first. It's quite incredible. There's one plan that we saw, coming out of Paris, and then the oil companies are saying something completely opposite. It feels like a perfect storm.
Well, yes, there's a perfect storm of factors, and we're clearly at a crossroads. It was actually nearly 200 countries that made this agreement, and this is historic. I mean, we've spent 20 years trying to get to this point. It's like a big flashing neon sign saying direction of travel. Now, I think the issue is many of the fossil fuel companies want to go in one direction, which is they still see themselves as growth companies. But this sign is saying, we need to go in this direction. No, we're not going to switch those fossil fuels off overnight. Over the next 30 years, we've got a budget of 900 gigatons, so we can still burn a lot, but we need to burn successively less. And I think the response to India, what if the clean energy is cheaper? We've done some financial analysis that tells us in many cases now, particularly for the world's energy poor, the clean energy solutions are the cheapest option. Because you don't have to build grids, you don't have to build big coal-fired power stations, you don't have to sort of run cables many hundreds, in some cases thousands of miles to where people are.
But the perception is it's more expensive. Because the India, for example, has all this infrastructure in place.
Well, it's like an oil tanker. I mean, the financial markets take time to catch up. When the world changes, and it is changing, it quite often takes many in the financial markets time to understand. And the problem is these companies have been good financial performers for decade after decade, but 5 or 6 years ago, the performance of many of these fossil fuel companies has not been so good. And if you actually really drill into that, you find what they've been doing is they've been taking revenues from historic lower cost oil, gas and coal and pouring that into very expensive projects. We've seen that recently with the Arctic, where Shell poured some 8 billion into the drilling there before it pulled out.
Anthony Yuan, in New York, I mean, what does this really mean for oil companies, these promises that have been made in Paris?
I think it's certainly a sea change in how the global energy market will look like. But I think for oil and energy companies, I think one of the key things about is what kind of reserve and production they have. Because if they are low-cost producers, they probably is able to weather the storm. Because if you look at where fossil fuel prices are, they're extremely competitive with renewable energy. And that's why we have seen how sort of Bill Gates and others really have to come up with a solution of driving R&D, because you have to further lower capital costs to make renewable energy much more competitive versus fossil fuels when oil, natural gas, and coal prices come down a lot. And also because it depends on how long and how much reserve those oil and other energy companies have. Because if they tend to have a shorter reserve life, they may be able to replace that with some other lower cost reserves. So that might actually sustain what they can do. But their valuation will come down partly because, well, price has gone down, but then the volume side, we have to see how that, whether it's going to be slowed down in terms of growth substantially or where that might be headed.
I'll bring you back in to this. I mean, where are these numbers coming from? 30 to 50% rise in demand in the same period?
Well, I think many of these companies are projecting increased demand for their products, and the amounts vary. But I think the important thing is if you look now, 160 countries in the run-up to Paris have put forward their climate plans, covering, I think, some 98% of emissions. This is not enough because it will only add up to getting us to 2.7 degrees, but it still, takes us beyond, below business as usual. So that's telling us we're going to have a reduction in emissions and therefore use of things like fossil fuels. The companies are saying, well, no, our plans tell us we're going to have a rise. There's a disconnect. How do you square that disconnect?
Indeed, so many questions that are being raised following the landmark climate deal in Paris. Anthony Hobley and Anthony Yuan in New York, thank you both for joining us. Well, that's it for this edition of Impact. Do stay